Hello and welcome to Sips and Solutions. I don't know if this is the first episode or the second episode. Our previous episode was a pilot episode. So welcome to Sips and Solutions, a YouTube show in which I'm going to be answering your questions which are related to language teaching and language learning. Today, I'm sipping lemon-infused water with ice. Let me know what you are sipping in the comments. I would love to know what you are drinking while you're watching this video. So, in this episode, I'm going to be answering top 3 questions that I got from my Telegram channel followers. I asked you to submit your questions and vote for the questions which you find to be the most interesting. So we are going to be tackling those today. Our most voted question comes from Ksenia and it reads, can you share your favorite activities that work brilliantly for recycling and revising when working with vocabulary with teen and adult students who have A2 or above? All right, so before we answer this brilliant question, let me quickly say that before we revise and recycle anything, we need to make sure that our students know the word, because you can't revise something that you didn't learn, okay? And knowing the word would usually mean that you need to focus on the form, like how the word is written, like the spelling, how the word is pronounced, the spoken form, meaning like what the word means. And there's use. Use is all about how the word is being used in real context. Surprise, surprise. So it could be common collocations, some grammar which is typically used with this very word or phrase. Is this word formal or informal? Is it frequent or not really frequent? So all of that is very important in order to know the word. And when we introduce vocabulary to our students, or grammar for that matter, it doesn't really matter, vocabulary, grammar, or like lexicalized chunks, you do the same thing. You need to make sure that students know how it's written, like what's the form. They need to know how to pronounce that. They need to know what it means, and they need to be aware of the restrictions, like use restrictions, frequency, register, common collocations. Again, it's a very long process, and it's also important to remember that learning a word is not a linear process, meaning that when you explain it to your students, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will remember that and use that accurately. So we need to make sure that we provide our students with ample practice opportunities so they can learn the word and use that. And then we kind of go and revise and recycle things. Now let's quickly talk about revision and recycling. These two are kind of similar, but if you look closer, you would see that there are some things that are setting them apart, okay? So revising is when you learn a word in a particular context and then you revise what this word means in that very context. So it's like familiar surrounding, you already know that, and you just revise that. Recycling, however, is about using the word in a new context. So it's proven that recycling the word deepens the knowledge about the word. So you are more likely to remember it better, okay? So when it comes to revising, I really like the classification by Scott Thornbury, which he presented in his book, How to Teach Vocabulary. So there are different types of activities which vary depending on the cognitive depth, meaning that some activities are not as cognitively challenging as others. For example, there is identification. For example, when you give your students a text and you ask them to underline all the adjectives, so they need to identify things. Then a more cognitively challenging task, that would be selecting. This is where you do like some multiple choice or something along these lines. Then there is matching, when they need to match the word and definition, the word and the context. Then there is sorting. Let's say that you give your students a list of words and you ask them to group them in different categories. Ranking, there are a list of words and you ask your students to rank the words in the order of importance or something like that. Then there is completion of sentences and texts, so it's more cognitively challenging. This is your typical gap fill or close gap activity. And then last but not least, this is creation of sentences and texts. So instead of using the prompts like we do in completion, we use the creation of sentences. So students need to write their own story or maybe say something like produce an utterance, produce like some sort of a speech where they use the target word. So again, it's identification, selecting, matching, sorting, ranking, completion, and creation. So all of them work. The idea that Scott Thornbury lays out in his book is that the more cognitively challenging the task is, the more likely students are to remember the word. And it makes sense. We are more likely to internalize something if we spend a lot of time thinking about it. So it would take us more effort to create a text than it would take us to select the word in a multiple choice activity. However, I think it's all about varying all of the activities, so you kind of need to do a little bit of everything just to make sure that the words stick. And again, you need to make sure that you provide ample practice opportunities for your students. And I think that if we just use cognitively challenging tasks at all times, it's going to overload our students, and I don't think this is what we need to do. It's good to keep your lessons cognitively challenging, but it's all about the balance, you know? When it comes to recycling, this is really about putting the words that we have already learned in a new context. So for me, that would be exposing my students to the words that we learned before. Let's say that we finished a unit, we learned a set of words, and then we begin a new unit. I try and see which words from the previous unit I can take and marry with the new topic. So let's say that when I'm asking my students like some lead-in questions or some discussion questions, I would make sure to use some of the words that we have already covered. It's also about forcing your students to produce certain words in contexts. Let's say that you can do some sort of forced output activity. Let's say that you ask them a question and you list the words that you want them to use in that very context. So it kind of can help you promote recycling as well. I think it's about exposure, like getting as much of texts and videos and everything with your target vocabulary and using it in a new context as well. To sum it all up, when I think about my favorite type of activity, by the way, I have a collection of revision and recycling activities on my blog. There is a highlight, there are some post series which you can check out. But when it comes to my most favorite revision and recycling activity, that has to be the questions. So I like asking my students discussion questions. Number one, I can make a discussion question which uses the target word. Number two, I can do the forced output activity, the one that I told you about. For example, I ask them a simple question and I invite them to use certain words. So I may like write the words that I want them to be using. I can ask them to create questions of their own, giving them a list of words that I want them to use. I can give them a list of questions and invite them to choose the questions that they want to answer. I can turn this into a game where they randomly pick the questions without knowing what questions they're going to get. So questions, I really love that because I think they kind of promote communication. And the way I see it as a teacher, I try to establish classroom setting where my students have a place to communicate and mean something in English. So questions, that's hands down my favorite revision and recycling activity of all. Our second most voted question comes from Ekaterina, and Ekaterina asks, how do you expand your vocabulary if there is no opportunity to speak the language and watching TV shows is boring? What a great question. There is a lot to unpack here. I think it's very important for us to establish from the word go that there is a difference between our receptive language command and our productive language command. For example, I assume as language teachers and very advanced language users could easily read any novel in English. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that we would be able to write a novel in English. So our receptive skills are a little bit better than our productive skills. And I think it works with vocabulary just the same way. If you think about watching TV shows and then watching them with the aim of expanding your vocabulary, you might expand your your receptive repertoire, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you would be using that in your speech. Which brings us to another very important point, which is, why would you use extended vocabulary on a daily basis? There is a principle which is called linguistic economy principle, and the idea is very simple. People use minimum effort to convey the maximum message. And it makes so much sense if you think about it. Like, why would someone say, it's unparalleled, it's second to none, if you can just say it's the best in your day-to-day conversations? If you think about, like, I don't know, if you are writing an article or a review, or you were attending a language class as a student, then yes, you would try and show off all of that vocabulary. But in reality, if you think about the way you use language one, we don't normally use all of those fancy schmancy phrases at all times. It makes no sense. We try to save energy by conveying the maximum message with minimum effort. So it's very natural for us to use the words which we are familiar with and fall back on the words that we know, words that are sometimes labeled as simple or basic or stop using these words, blah, blah, blah. There's nothing wrong with them. And it makes total sense. And it's absolutely natural for us to use the words which are familiar to us. Now, let's unpack the next element of this question. Watching TV shows is boring. If this is boring, don't watch TV shows. Find something that floats your boat. And I think that getting, rich exposure is a great tip on improving your vocabulary and your receptive skills. Perfect. Why not? If you find TV shows boring, try YouTube videos. For example, I love watching commentary YouTube videos and I watch them all the time. I love that. I love true crime podcasts. So I don't really listen to some, elaborate and fancy podcasts. I listen to something that floats my boat. All right. So find something that you find interesting. It doesn't have to be films or TV series. Anything that you are interested in your language one, find that in your target language, and that's it. And then there is another element of this question, like how do I expand it if there is no opportunity to speak the language? Here, I think that what is meant is that, okay, so how do I put it into a good use if there is no speaking partner? Let's say that you are a teacher teaching young learners and you have to grade the language. So all of the words that you acquired, all of the words that you learned, you don't really have a chance to, boast all of that. Well, step number 1, start blogging. This is how I practice language all the time. Like right now, I am recording this video in English and it could work as a little speaking practice opportunity. If this is something that you are interested in, you can do that. It doesn't have to be a public blog. You can create your own study blog, which is private for you. And that's it. So you just have a reason to talk to yourself in English. Number 2, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I don't really need a speaking partner. I am myself a speaking partner for myself. I just think to myself in English. I don't know if you do that all the time, but sometimes I talk to myself when I'm cooking, when I'm cleaning. Well, it could be like talking to myself, or I can just think to myself in English. I do all sorts of personalization activities, like I learned a new word and I'm thinking about all the possible contexts I could use that in, and I kind of play those out in my head. I do that not necessarily with English, I do that with Indonesian, which I'm learning from scratch right now. So I learned a cool word, a cool collocation, and I try and toy with this collocation in my mind. And again, I don't need anyone to practice it with, I have myself. When it comes to putting it into practice, I would suggest exploring some self-study routines, let's say blogging, writing, journaling, or thinking to yourself in the foreign language. I don't think that you necessarily have to have a partner to practice that. One more question, which we are going to unpack, comes from Luba, and Luba asks, how do you come up with topics for your classes? Where do you get your inspiration from? This is such a cool question because, right now I'm designing a course from scratch and I'm documenting the process, all the ups and downs and in-betweens. It's mostly downs right now. So I started a little reality TV show on my Reels on Instagram. So yeah, it's tough. I'm not going to lie. So what helps me is when I'm choosing the topics for my class, I need to bear my students in mind. I need to think about what they want to discuss, what their learning needs and preferences are. And I try to find the topic which is genuinely interesting for everyone to discuss. So I sometimes ask my teacher learners, okay, so what do you want to discuss? Which topics are interesting to you? And then I use that to kind of springboard to my lesson planning, so I kind of use that as inspiration. I ask my students at all times. Sometimes what happens is that I let my students bring the topics in. Sometimes they ask questions in the chat and I just, again, use this idea and exploit to the fullest. Sometimes I select the topics which are interesting to me. So I'm reading a lot of things in English, mostly on Instagram. I am watching a lot of stuff in English, so I can use a couple of ideas and then bring them into my classroom to discuss. So something that I find interesting, something new and exciting, and something that I want to talk about. That could be a personal metric for me. And I think that inspiration can come from anywhere, but what I've noticed, this is a little life hack. Whenever I like something, at first it was all scattered, I wanted to save a real video or an article, and it was all over the place. What I started doing right now, I started using Telegram private channels. So I have a channel with ideas, with language chunks. And if I see something, I can either screenshot it, screen record that, or maybe copy the link and paste it in this chat. So this is something that I've recently started doing. And so far I'm enjoying it. a lot. I used to use Notion for that very purpose. But, well, it's not as flexible as Telegram, because with Telegram I can record a voice message, I can record the video, not just share the content that has been created by someone else. But I started doing that. So when I come across something that I like and I can potentially use that for my lesson, I just select that, screenshot that, and post it there. I think that, well, anything can spark inspiration. The problem is that we sometimes rely on our brains too much, like, to remember a certain thing, and then we never do. And if you feel like bereft of ideas, you can go back to this Telegram chat and see all of the things that you have highlighted. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to use those, but maybe they can serve as inspiration and again, spark some creativity as well. Right, just because the previous 2 questions got the same amount of votes, I'm going to pick one more question. Cheers. Question comes from Anastasia. Anastasia asks, what books or articles on teaching groups would you recommend? I'm going to recommend my live stream about teaching groups. So last year, or a couple of years ago, yeah, I think it was last year, I did an experiment where I did an expert week in my Instagram blog. So I posted stories about teaching groups, and I also conducted a live stream. I'm going to re-upload the live stream and post it on my YouTube so it's easier for you to watch. I shared all the books, all the recommendations, and answered all the questions about teaching groups. So it's basically the embodiment of everything I know about teaching groups. Again, it depends on what exactly you want to be working on when it comes to teaching groups, because there are a lot of things that you can work on and a lot of things which may potentially go wrong with groups. I think what makes teaching groups a little bit easier is the fact that a lot of publishing houses, when they create course books, they are usually built with group classes in mind. That's why if you open a teacher's book of any course book, for example, the one that I'm thinking of right now is Evolve. If you open the teacher's books, you would see that there are some notes like, okay, so if you have fast finishers, do this. If you have late finishers, do this. If you have mixed ability, do this. So there are a lot of factors that we need to bear in mind when teaching groups, and there are a lot of problems that we have to deal with. But on the top of my head, I can recommend a couple of books. For example, there is a book which is called Activities for Cooperative Learning. I love this, especially if you're looking for some practical hands-on activity with your group. That's a great book. I love that, and I use a lot of activities from there. Okay, then there is another book which is called Mixed Ability Teaching, because, well, it doesn't matter how good your placement process is, every group that you're going to be teaching is going to be mixed ability. So you can check that out if this is something that worries you. There's one more book which is called Exploring Psychology and Language Teaching and Learning. It has a chapter on groups, group dynamics, group forming stages, all the psychological issues that we have to deal with when we are teaching groups, because, well, a group is a set of individuals and everyone has their own needs, goals, priorities, preferences, and stuff like that. So these are probably the top 3 books that I can recommend right now. But again, I highly recommend my live stream and my stories on my Instagram, which is all about groups, because I think I did a fabulous job of sharing everything that I know there. Okay, and that brings us to the end of this episode of Yuliya's Tips and Solutions. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think of this episode, and I will see you around.